All right, good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to First Bank's Paycheck Protection Program webinar series. I'm Mike Vanderveld, and I'll be your facilitator. Before we get started, allow me to cover a few logistics. The lines are muted, but at any time, please send us your questions through the webinar tool. We did get several in advance of the session, and we've worked some of those answers into the presentation. As always, we'll take all of the submitted questions and create an FAQ, which will be posted along with the recording of this session to the First Bank COVID site soon after we end. All right, on to slide number 2. Let's meet our presenters. Tim Fogerty is back, and he leads First Bank's Midwest Commercial Banking team. Eric Hallgren joins us today. He is the Director of Underwriting at First Bank. We also have Charles Jellinek, a partner at Bryan Cave Leighton Paisner. You'll find their bios in the handout section of the webinar tool. On to slide 3, let's take a look at the agenda. Mr. Fogerty will start us off today with PPP updates. Next, Eric Hallgren will provide some insight on the First Bank forgiveness process. And then Mr. Jellinek will cover some legal issues related to staff returning to work. And as I flip over to slide number 4, this is the legal disclaimer. Please bear with me, I am required to read this. This presentation is furnished for informational use only. It is not intended to be comprehensive, nor does it constitute legal, accounting, tax, or other professional advice. We encourage you to consult with your legal, tax, and/or accounting professional for specific advice. This presentation is based on information available as of the first date and time of delivery of this presentation. Due to the evolving nature of the regulations and agency guidance addressing the Paycheck Protection Program, all information in this presentation is subject to change without notice. First Bank recommends a thorough review of the CARES Act and SBA interim final rules. These documents can be found at firstbanks.com. All right, we are ready to dive in. I'm going to flip it over to slide number 5 and welcome in Mr. Tim Fogerty.
Okay, thank you, Micah. Thanks, Mike, and thanks to everybody for joining us today. We have a big crowd, and special thanks for Charles Jellinek at Bryan Cave for joining us as we try to add some additional information through a series of webinars now and in the future on topics that we think would be important for our business clients. Let's get started. So on the, we have a lot to cover today. On the PPP communications front, we have sent out 4 secure emails to our PPP borrowers with updates on our program. These emails were addressed to the person who signed the PPP loan, and they are from an email box address firstbank_PPP_forgiveness@fbol.com. We are tracking PPP borrowers that have not yet opened these emails, and we have 200, 300, 400 people that have not opened these emails yet. So what we're asking you to do is look for this communication, establish a password, and read the emails. You may need to look in your junk or spam or quarantine filters for this information. If you cannot locate these emails, please reach out to your First Bank contact and we will resend it to you. And then the prior emails are in the addendum section of this presentation. And I think it's important to realize a lot of the information that you'll be sending us contains personal identifiable information. It needs to be protected. And as such, we want to be able to use a secure website so that you and your employees are their personal information is protected. Thank you. So we will use this site in ongoing communications for the forgiveness process. If you would like to add a carbon copy to someone, you can do that by just responding to the email with the name and address of the person you'd like to add. So the email address was set up for the person who was authorized to sign the loan documentation when we sent it all out during the disbursement portion of the program. Sometimes that's not the right person for all the other information, so you can add one person to that. And then we will also add a link to our COVID-19 website for this. And First Bank forgiveness application process, everybody's calling about it. It's going to open when the SBA opens. We're going to get that. We're going to go through our process today, and we'll get to that with Eric's presentation. Eric, you want to, Brother Mike, can you go to the next slide, please? So long expected, we had to change the presentation a bit this morning. We were waiting for, we had expected an updated FAQ for quite some time from the SBA. It came in last night. So we've updated some of this presentation to include relevant information on the FAQ that came out last night, August the 4th. We've already put that FAQ from the SBA on our website, so you look at the complete document, several pages long. It's out there. We're just going to go through some highlighted information off of that today. The SBA has issued procedural notices that indicate that they will begin accepting PPP forgiveness submissions from lenders when the new software they have developed is available. And so we're going to do this electronically. We can submit to them electronically. They're indicated to us they're ready to go with that. And the tentative date right now is August the 10th. That's next Monday. The SBA will launch the new forgiveness. Well, I will say that Congress right now, and we've had a number of pre-questions on this, and Congress right now is going through the Continuing Small Business Recovery and Paycheck Protection Program Act. So this, what they're, and it's got bipartisan approval from both houses. We don't have a date when it could go into effect, but it is relevant to the forgiveness process. And I'm not going to go into detail. I'm going to cover a couple items right now. It's not in the deck that could change assuming that this legislation is passed. And part of this also, the last bullet point, if some of this platform, if some of this is passed and it changes some of the documentation and requirements for PPP forgiveness, the SBA has said they may delay the August 10th date to incorporate that. And from what we're hearing, it could be something that is voted on this week or early next week, but clearly in the coming weeks. So some of the key information is an expansion in that program of some of the allowable uses and some of the uses for forgiveness. So they've expanded that section of it, and if this did become law, it would in fact change some of the forgiveness documents. But some of the items included are payment for any software, cloud computing, other human resources and accounting needs, property damages as a result of public disturbances that occurred during 2020 that were not covered by insurance, covered supplier costs, expenditures to a supplier pursuant to a contract for goods prior to, that you had a contract prior to the 15th of February 2020, and covered worker protection expenditures, protective PPE, personal protective equipment, and adaptive investments to help the loan recipient comply with health safety guidelines related to COVID-19 during a period of March 1st of 2020 to December. So those are some added costs that would be eligible to use the PPP money for and get forgiveness for. Also, probably more highlighted in the media is the forgiveness process. So there clearly the ABA, our trade association, and many other trade associations have been lobbying for a simplified application for forgiveness. The pending act has two different sections, two different amounts of loans that will be amended if approved. For loans under $150,000, borrowers will not be required to submit to the lender the documentation required in the CARES Act, but must attest to good faith effort to comply with payment protection program requirements and retain records for 3 years, and may complete and submit. You also may be required to complete and submit demographic information. The administrator, which is the SBA, will be available to review and audit any of the borrowers after the fact. But the importance here is they would simplify the approval process to a one-page attestation that would be signed for forgiveness. So that would ease the requirement to provide a lot of the supporting documentations for forgiveness for loans under $150,000. For loans between $150,000 and actually that is 85% basically of all the loans approved, of the 5.5 million of loans approved, 85% of them would be eligible for this. For loans between $150,000 and $2 million, the borrower is also not required to submit the documentation required by the CARES Act, all the payroll records and expenses. You'll be required to retain the relevant records and worksheets for 3 years, and you may be required to submit the demographic information. Again, you still fill it out. For those borrowers, they would complete the forms, certifications, and worksheets, but not be required to provide the supporting documentation. So it's a much more streamlined situation. In part of this is recommendations, and we'll get into that in a little bit. These are not approved. They're pending approval that has bipartisan support, and we will continue to communicate this as we know more. We've also had several other questions from clients that have been asking about phase 2 or another phase of PPP. And that is also part of the Continuing Small Business Recovery and Paycheck Protection Act that's pending approval. So in this particular case, there would be an ability to borrow additional funds on a second draw on the PPP loans. The eligibility, you would still need to meet size eligibility standards. You could have no more than 300 or fewer employees at one location. And the key is you need to demonstrate a 50% reduction in gross receipts in the first or second quarter of 2020 when compared to the same quarter in 2019. So most of the issues that occurred in businesses were the second quarter, but there was some that could have been the first quarter. So those would be some of the qualifications. There was additional qualifications for this. The loan limit would be $2 million. The limit on phase 1 and this is $10 million. So if you had $10 million borrowed in the first program, you would not be eligible for this part of the program. And so but other than that, it's pretty similar to the first phase of the PPP. So we will keep you current on that as it develops. Obviously, it's in the media. It's not really tied to the HEALS Act. It's independent of that. Stay tuned. So Mike, we can go on to then recommendations for this process. So the deadline for applying for the forgiveness is 10 months after the end of the covered period, which can be up to 24 weeks. So a significant amount of time to apply for forgiveness. If your loan is less than $2 million, just like I talked about in this pending legislation, if your loan is less than $2 million, you may want to wait to the outcome of that legislation before you apply for forgiveness, because it's a much more streamlined process. We also recommend that you take advantage of the extended cover periods if you need to, up to 24 weeks. You can make it 12 weeks, 16 weeks. But when you apply, a vast majority, you can do up to 60% for payroll cost. There's nothing wrong with doing 80% or 90% of payroll costs, and we recommend taking that option. And as always, not in the bullet point, but please in writing for the company any qualified reductions in FTE. If you have qualified that are because the person refused to come back to work, or was unable to come back to work, and Eric will go through some of those in the presentation. Please document that, and also document the need for the justification need for the PPP loan. In all cases, even with the amended legislation, we also recommended retaining all records, regardless of size. PPP borrowers are subject to an audit by the SBA. And in addition, when you start this process, we would recommend that you review our website for the past PPP webinars and slide decks for guidance and information on completing forgiveness applications. And right now, there's 2 forgiveness applications that Eric's going to get into. And if you qualify for the easy form, and we'll go through those, we recommend that. That's a much simpler process than going through that would be the 33508 EZ form, and there's some qualifications to apply for that. And with that, I think I will hand it over to Eric right now to kind of go through the First Bank forgiveness process.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks everyone for joining this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are. Mike, I think we want to go over one more slide and we'll get started here on the PPP forgiveness process. So over the next handful of slides, we're going to toggle between our application workbook as well as basically a client-initiated survey to pull an application specific to that entity. So we'll be toggling back and forth between these slides, but the goal here is to provide some perspective, a brief example, hopefully not getting too far in the weeds, but also want to be as helpful to providing information as possible. So, as this says, we're gonna walk through a client-initiated application request and go through what is required to do that and how it's going to be done. We're going to highlight the standard forgiveness application, Form 3508 and Form 3508EZ. And while the SBA has provided those forms, and those forms are available on their website as well as interactive PDFs forms from their website, First Bank has elected to digitize the application for both forms into a standard form that flows through our process in a more automated basis, as well as provide some functionality for client experience as it relates to applications as well as pre-population. And we'll kind of highlight a lot of that stuff as we go through. And then we'll cover kind of what happens next after I have completed my application and I'm ready to hit submit. So Mike, why don't we go to the next slide? So as an entity or a business, you're now ready to apply for forgiveness. Your covered period is up or the funds have been exhausted and you're ready to submit for full forgiveness. And that's why what Tim mentioned earlier in terms of the secure email communication is so critically important. That secure email will be the conduit for First Bank to send as well as clients to return back application as well as supporting documentation. So it's critical that that connection and that secure email is verified and frankly that communication channel is open. But there's going to be two different processes to kind of self-identify which application fits your company's circumstances. The first is the survey link will be embedded once it's available and once it's going live on August 10th within the email communication that you'll be receiving, the standard weekly email communication. It'll be a link that says, hey, are you ready for forgiveness? Please click here. And then also on top of that, we're going to supply it on our First Bank COVID-19 page. It's not out there yet. We're waiting to marry our opening alongside the SBA, as Tim mentioned earlier. So it is targeted for August 10th, but depending what happens in Congress over the next 4 days, it may delay that. So to complete your forgiveness form or your request form, you're really going to need a couple of things. Your tax ID number to help us ensure we find and are able to customize your application for you when we return it. The covered period you're electing to file under, and then a qualification in terms of whether or not you can certify your EZ form eligible. So once this form is completed, and we'll walk through it here briefly in a second, once it's completed, you can anticipate a 24-hour response via email with the appropriate application for your business based on the answers as well as the data that we have on file. So Mike, why don't we click over to the survey form, if you don't mind. So Mike's going to kind of click through as I talk through it. This will be housed, as I said earlier, via the link in an email, as well as our COVID-19 page. It includes a standard disclaimer, similar to what Mike had read off prior. And Mike, if you just want to hit click next, and we'll go to the next slide. So again, this is where you're going to put in your tax ID number. Mike has pre-populated with quote unquote dummy information. A certified an answer of yes that we are ready to apply for loan forgiveness, and then our elected covered period. In this case, we're going to say it's 24 weeks. And Mike, you can go ahead and click next. And then we highlight the three opportunities for someone to qualify for an EZ form. As Tim mentioned earlier, to the extent possible, the EZ form is a lot, well, frankly, easier for businesses to apply for forgiveness. The amount of paperwork required, as well as some of the data that needs to be populated in the application, is quite less, and you'll see that here shortly. So to the extent you can, take advantage of the EZ form, and the three different qualifiers for what you could qualify for EZ are listed there. Once you click yes, I want the EZ form, question 5 will come up, where you will have to identify which of those three circumstances apply to you, and you can apply as many as are relevant. So it's more than just one if necessary. And then once you're done, you click submit, and a submission thank you comes up, and it'll notice that you'll be expected to receive a turnaround of 24 hours. So what does that mean, right? So 24 hours goes by, you receive an email from First Bank Forgiveness, and we'll walk through that Excel file that's going to be attached to that. Mike, if you want to pull up the Form 3508 Excel file, and we'll kind of show what one looks like here. So Mike, if you want to go tab over to the second tab on the left, on the left side, Mike. So click, yeah, there you go. So the first tab on the left, we're not going to walk through, but it's just instructions, provide some detail and data in terms of what each of the cell references are, where you could find them, and we tried to make it as, no offense to Charles, tried to remove the legalese a little bit and from an interpretation standpoint of what each of these data elements means. But when you receive your forgiveness application, you could expect that the first three big groups of blue fields, while those are manual entry fields and required fields to submit a complete application, we're going to pre-populate all that data for you to the extent that it's available in our systems. You know, for filling out an application, you should expect to always, or you're expected to have your SBA number, so we're going to pre-populate that, the loan number, as well as some other, company-specific items. If any of these fields are missing, there'll be a required kind of red flag notice on column D that'll pop up that is dynamic, so it'll go away once it's pre-populated. Some of the things on this manual box that you will not see populated from us are the employees at time of application, as well as forgiveness. That's row 20 and 21. The election of your payroll schedule, covered period, beginning and ending. So I've went ahead and pre-populated this from just frankly made up data. And again, I guess I didn't say this from the beginning, but we took the application that the SBA has provided, they sequenced it from pages 1 through 5. And as we looked at it and we thought about how somebody would go about applying for it, we reorganized the tabs to basically flow how a user would actually go through the process of completing the application. So this first step is really to fill out and make sure these blue fields, basically borrower identification fields, are correct. And then we'll move forward to the next tab, Mike, if you can, is schedule a worksheet. And again, this is for the full form. And we've digitized both table 1 and table 2 from the full form, and there's up to 500 rows for each. So it should be accommodating. And frankly, if it's not, with Excel, the functionality to add and frankly merge files to port in these employees is pretty easy. So again, this is, frankly made up data, but the employee's name is listed. The last four of their social security number is listed in column C for employee identifier. Their cash compensation during the covered period, and then that aggregates up to box 1. Anything that is not listed in blue and has that orange text is auto calculating and auto summing, and that feature will carry through the tabs as those data elements are needed. Average FTE identified as 1 to 0.5. There's some definitions around that, including the instructions tab, as well as any reductions that occurred from a salary or hourly wage standpoint during that covered period. And then we move over to table 2, and those are just for employees that are compensated up to $100,000 or more in cash compensation on an annualized basis, and basically factoring into how much that was during this covered period, which this example is based on an 8-week time frame. So this data is aggregated and auto-summed, and then those box 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 will now carry through for us to schedule A, page 3, Mike, if you want to click on that. And this is where the worksheet comes in for the full form, Schedule A, to really break down your cash compensation from Table 2 for employees that are higher than $100,000 on an annualized basis, and then the non-cash compensation payroll components. In this case, I've pre-filled it with $20,000, $15,000, and $10,000 for health insurance, employee contributions for retirement plans, as well as state and local taxes paid by the employer. Those are just, obviously standard items that would be contemplated for kind of the non-cash payroll component for eligible forgiveness expenses paid during the covered period. Again, it's going to sum total for your total payroll costs. And then, Mike, if you want to scroll down a little bit from here, you'll see that there's a couple blue cells here, and these really relate to your ability to claim safe harbor under the Safe Harbor 1 and 2 that are detailed in the instructions, as well as the standard SBA 3508 forms. And really that'll dictate what happens on those last three boxes, lines 11, 12, and 13. Basically, if you can claim safe harbor, and in this case, we're claiming FTE reduction safe harbor 2, that we did not reduce staff and we're staffed at the same level as we were before, it will autofill your quotient to 1.0. And no need to fill out lines 11 and 12. That functionality is embedded to carry through. So this is when we're actually not going to go left to right. We're going to go back to that page 1, Mike. Nope, next one over. There you go. And if you scroll down a little bit, Mike, you'll see that this is kind of the final components of that page 1. It'll get to the point of how we identify what our forgiveness amount is. And in this case, the payroll cost, the aggregate payroll cost, including the non-cash component, has been aggregated into line 1. Those 3 blue cells allow us to fill in covered expenses that are non-payroll. So, Mike, if you want to go ahead and put $10,000 in on line 2 where it says business rent or lease payments for us, one more cell down, or that's fine. Yep, that's good. What will happen now is that it'll aggregate those, and you will basically auto-calculate your forgiveness amount. And that's going to be a function of the smallest of lines 8, 9, and 10, with a goal, obviously, for full forgiveness. We want that line 9, your PPP loan amount, to be the lowest, so you'd receive full forgiveness. And in this case, we're receiving a full forgiveness exactly at $223,864. So that is the extent of the worksheet and the full Form 3508 workbook. Mike, if you go to the right, second from the last, that's the borrower certification page. Really, that's the second page of what the 3508 form is. Similar to what the original application was, there are initial requirements and certifications. I pre-filled all of these for us as well, and scroll down and there would be a signature block or signature component that I've already pre-filled as well. So that's the extent of the requirements for the Form 3508. We have included the demographic information, page 5 on the far right, again as an interactive tab. It is optional. Sorry, it's in print view mode right now, but it is an optional form, but it does help for reporting and data collection purposes. And that's the extent of this form. We would then save it as Form 3508, Company ABC, and prepare to submit it. And now, Mike, if you don't mind, we'll quickly toggle over to that other Excel file, the Form 3508EZ. And I'm going to spend a real brief amount of time on this, but what this is, and I think it's pretty obvious to anybody on the phone viewing the screen, it's much more simple of a form. Really, all the data elements that you're looking to populate are going to be on page 1, and a good majority of those are going to be pre-populated to the extent that the data is available from our end. So again, this is the exact same example. I just elected to use EZ form for this one. And Mike, if you scroll down, what you'll find here is that there is no Schedule A worksheet feeding line 1 for payroll cost. It is a hard code manual field. And then the data requirements to supplement or to justify those are noted in the 3508 EZ instructions. But again, this is a situation where the forgiveness amount is 100% of what the loan amount is. Similar to the last form, we've got a borrower certification page 2, as well as the demographic form. There's 1 or 2 more certifications. We don't have to go through it, Mike, specifically, but there'll be 1 or 2 more certifications on the EZ form to rep and warrant that you do qualify for EZ when you're submitting your application. And then again, that demographic information on page 5 is provided. And I actually filled this one out to show it's fairly modest from a work effort standpoint to identify demographic information. And again, it's an optional field, but it's provided for all borrowers that intend to use it. So those are the easy forms. That's the way they're built today. Again, the first tab on the far left, which we didn't go into great detail, spells out in fair detail what each of the data elements is, as well as the sequence with which a user that's populating this should proceed. Frankly, going through that first tab of page 1, going and validating the business data, and then moving for a full form, moving through the worksheet for Schedule A, and then Schedule A, and what have you. So Mike, I think we're good to kind of click back to the slideshow really quick, if you don't mind. And we'll go ahead and click, I think, through 2 or 3 slides here. We'll pass those by. Okay, so we're almost done, or I'm almost done, I guess, for this section. So what's next, right? I've completed my Excel form. I believe I have all of the data that I need to submit for forgiveness. So what we would ask you to do is to review and verify once more that your form is complete and accurate and consistent with what your documentation would support. You would collect both that Excel form, a signed version of that Excel form, a PDF version of that Excel form, prepare all of the supporting documentation. If it's payroll and you're able to justify full forgiveness on just payroll, just send us full payroll documentation to support that covered period. If you have to rely on non-payroll covered expenses, that's perfectly fine. And then we would just be looking for the documentation to justify those non-payroll expenses and their eligibility, frankly, for coverage for forgiveness. When all of that's ready, you would simply reply to the email that you received that application from, or send directly to firstbank_PPP_forgiveness@FVOL with that Excel application, as well as the various attachments to support that justification. All submissions will be reviewed and processed in the time or the sequence with which they're received. So there's no preferential treatment. It is literally the order that they come in, and they'll be processed as quickly as possible. We'll run an automatic scrub tool upon submission, excuse me, and you could expect to receive correspondence directly to the email or replying to that email if there's a missing item or that initial review determined that the application wasn't necessarily complete. So that will occur within a fairly short order after submission, and then First Bank is obviously committed to getting all of the submissions done in the most timely extent possible, and most definitely within 60 days, which is required by the SBA for submission. But the goal obviously is to push these through quicker than the 60 days would stipulate. So Mike, I think that's it. I think I'm going to turn it over to Tim for some quick updates on the FAQs.
Okay, thank you, Eric. I'm going to go through these quickly here. Again, as I said, we're posting the entire FAQ that was released last night on our website with a lot more detail. But these, I picked out a few that we get a lot of questions on. So we'll kind of go through these quickly. The first question, how is the amount of owner compensation that's eligible for forgiveness determined? The amount of compensation of the owners who work at the business, and that's a separate section of forgiveness, which they've separated employees from owner employees in that section. The amount depends on whether you choose the 8-week or the 24-week period. The forgiveness amount for employee owners or self-employed individual payroll is capped at $20,883. And then if they chose if you are still at the 8-week option, it's $15,385. And what's interesting, if you have different companies that applied for PPP loans, the total compensation across all businesses that receive a PPP loan, they're still capped at those dollar amounts. So they would need to spread those amounts under different businesses, but that's the cap spread across multiple borrowers. We get a lot of questions, and then they go into detail about, C Corps and S Corps. What we get a lot of question on is self-employed, Schedule C or Schedule F farmers. So if you're a Schedule E or F, which is for farmers, the compensation is when we applied for the PPP loan, the application was to your tax return, so from the prior year. So the compensation of self-employed borrowers and self-employed individuals that is eligible for forgiveness is limited to 2.5 times, or 2.5 months, basically the same calculation of net profit as reported by on your IRS Schedule 1040C or F. And so that was your basically how you calculate with a max of either $20,000 or $15,000 for the 8-week period. So for those individuals, that is also the test for, it's the same calculation for the max loan amount as it is for the forgiveness. And in these cases, we already have the information that's, you were required to send that tax return to us to validate your maximum loan amount. That's the same information in those cases for these types of borrowers for the forgiveness. So I think that clarifies a lot of the questions around self-employed contractors or individuals. I'll go on to the next one, please, Mike. Are payments made on recently renewed leases or interest payments on refinanced mortgage loans eligible for forgiveness if the original lease or mortgage existed prior to the 15th? So I think that we had a number of questions about they had a lease, it expired during the covered period. Does that still qualify? The answer is yes. If you had a lease that expired and was renewed, whether for equipment or for real estate, you can continue to count that as being a lease that was executed before February the 15th. We have a number of questions on the next one, Mike. And there was a part that we talked about this a couple of times in prior webinars, that they added transportation expenses, but they never really clarified what that was. So in this FAQ, they did, this is on the non-payroll costs, non-wages, non-payroll costs, the additional, which could be up to 40% of your forgiveness amount, same category as interest payments and rent, et cetera, and utility payments. They had this transportation expense. And that transportation expense is really, so they clarified it, it's tied to really your utility expenses in some geographies. You may have a utility provider and a utility electricity transportation provider in various jurisdictions, and I think they were tying those together. So if you have two different providers for utility services, one that provides it, one provides the transportation or the transmission of electricity, that would also be included in an expense. Are electricity charges eligible for forgiveness? And the answer to that was yes. The entire electricity bill is eligible for forgiveness, including supply charges, which is the transportation, distribution charges, and other charges such as gross tax receipts. So basically anything on that utility bill. Okay, so again, we'll put this up on our website, fairly self-explanatory. A lot of the stuff in the FAQ was a repeat of prior guidance from the SBA. So with that, again, here's our resources it's available to you with the Department of Treasury, SBA, as well as our own website. We will all the way also put this recorded webinar will be posted on our website, as well as the decks that were used today by the end of the day today. And so with that, Mike, I'd like to turn it over to Charles for his presentation.
All right, Charles, I got you unmuted there.
Great. Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Tim. And good morning, good afternoon to everyone. We're going to share a little bit of information in the remaining part of this program today regarding return to work issues, as many employers are starting to contemplate bringing their folks either back to work in the office or continue to deal with just issues of having people work remotely. Some issues that are really coming to the forefront right now regarding people and employees' inability to work due to COVID-related reasons. And the two things we're going to chat about today briefly are the Families First Coronavirus Response Act and its requirements and compliance issues there, and then also some issues regarding the Americans with Disabilities Act and accommodating employees who are in high-risk groups due to pre-existing medical conditions, as well as pregnant employees. And I want to start first with the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. I think most folks are aware this was a law that was passed very early on in the beginning of the pandemic, right about the time the CARES Act was passed, and it provided 2 new forms of protected leave that employees could apply for if they had a COVID-19 related reason to request this leave. The new forms of leave were 80 hours of job protected paid sick leave, and then 12 weeks, depending on eligibility, for partially paid job protected emergency family and medical leave. So I'll call the one PSL and the other one EFMLA throughout the rest of this program. The good thing about this law, well, there's 2 good things about it. While it's a substantial administrative burden for the covered employers to deal with, it sunsets. It's not going to exist past this year. It expires on December 31, provided Congress doesn't extend it. And also the benefits, the paid benefits that you pay your employees who are eligible and take this form of leave, you get a payroll tax credit equal to 100% of the FFCRA wages that you pay to your employees under these new provisions. That's a general overview. Let's dig in a little bit first. Next slide. First, who's covered? I know we have a mix of folks and companies on this program today, so we ought to at least talk about, who's covered under this. To the extent you haven't already considered this with your legal counsel or you haven't had these issues jump up yet, let's do a quick reminder. Certain public employers are covered. I don't think we have a whole lot of those on this call, but state government, municipalities, cities are covered by this law, and then also all private employers with fewer than 500 employees. And it still remains a mystery to me why this is only applicable to smaller, that is, employers with less than 500 employees as opposed to larger ones as well. But it seems to be the mid-size and smaller companies are the only ones that got hit hard with this. And so you may be asking yourself, okay, well, who do I count to make sure I know whether I'm covered or not? Who do I count? Well, when trying to figure out if you're covered by this law and have the under 500 employee threshold, you certainly need to count all employees based in the United States and any territory. You count all your full-time and part-time employees. You count employees who are on any kind of leave currently, whether it's sick or FMLA, et cetera. And then, of course, any other day laborers that are supplied by a temporary agency or contracting company that you're using. You do not count, however, any employees that you have outside the United States, any bona fide independent contractors, any folks who have been laid off or otherwise furloughed. So this presents an interesting issue. If you had 520 employees, 3 or 4 months ago, but you've undertaken a layoff or a furlough, and you now have only 480 employees, while you might not have been covered by the FFCRA before, you can jump into coverage if you terminated or laid off or furloughed folks to put you under the 500 employee threshold to be covered. So you need to be monitoring that if you're one of those employers that are in that 470 to 520 range and your workforce fluctuates, because you do this calculation of coverage as of the date that an employee is requesting leave and their leave will start. Next slide. For some of the really small companies that are on this call, you might be saying, is there any good news for me? What if I'm really small? What if I have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, 10 employees? There is a small business exception, but I will tell you it's not a great exception. It only applies to one form of the leave, and that's the child care leave under either the paid sick leave or EFMLA provisions. But you have to, it really is quite a burden to show that you're entitled to this exception. You have to show that the leave is going to really be, almost, mind-blowingly jeopardizing to your business. It's a very, very high threshold. So if you're contemplating taking advantage of this exception, we certainly advise that you consult with legal counsel to make sure that you can actually establish that application of this law to your business is going to be business jeopardizing. Otherwise, I think you should err on the side of figuring that anybody with under 500 employees is probably going to be covered by the FFCRA. Next slide. So who's eligible? Who can take this benefit? Really, it's all employees, regardless. For paid sick leave, it's going to be regardless of the length of employment. If somebody's been with you 2 days, they're eligible. For the EFMLA provisions, though, an employee has to have been with you at least 30 calendar days. There are some exceptions of healthcare employees, healthcare providers being exempt. I will tell you, and I'm going to point out a couple of different places too where this is now become an issue. But yesterday, a federal court in the Southern District of New York invalidated a number of the Department of Labor's regulations regarding this law. This is one of them, the healthcare provider definition. The other one was the right to intermittent leave under this law. The other one was the availability of work provision. And I'm going to talk about each of those as we go through. But it's critical that as you're thinking about it, administering these new forms of leave, that you're regularly engaging with, HR professionals and your legal counsel, because the Department of Labor has published no fewer than 60 some odd FAQs on this. They've published interim guidance, then formal regulations, and now some of these regulations have been invalidated. So for such a short-term emergency piece of legislation, it's had all kinds of problems, all kinds of issues, and all kinds of interpretation, and it changes daily. And to get it right, you really need to be interacting regularly with counsel. Next slide. So what are the reasons that entitle someone to one of these forms of leave? Well, for paid sick leave, there's 6 different reasons that would qualify you for the 80 hours of paid sick leave that an employee can ask for, and they're enumerated here on this slide. But they largely all deal with some COVID-related reason why somebody is unable to work or telework. The first reason is they're subject to a federal, state, or local quarantine or isolation order that prevents them from working. They've been advised by a healthcare professional to self-quarantine because they either have it or they're experiencing symptoms, or they're caring for someone who is either subject to a quarantine order or is experiencing symptoms, or they're caring for a child because the child's school, daycare, summer camp, et cetera, has been closed or unavailable. And this is the one where we're really going to see an explosion here with schools issuing, reissuing, changing, and amending their open plans, their closed plans, online learning, hybrid learning. It's just created havoc for many employers throughout the country and for their employees, trying to figure out, how am I going to come to work when I need to be home with school-age kids to make sure they're going to be able to do this online learning. And so that's really the biggest one that we're seeing here as far as paid sick leave. And that's the other reason why, in addition to paid sick leave, you can also request the emergency FMLA. So if you've got the child care of your son or daughter because the school is closed or the child care provider is closed, that entitles you to ask for emergency FMLA. So some of you may be asking, for FMLA, how does it tie into the old FMLA? It essentially just creates a new reason for which you can ask for FMLA. Only there's all the requirements that you used to have. You had to be work for 1,250 hours, been employed for 12 months, et cetera. Those don't apply. So it's a new form of FMLA that people, there's a new reason for which people can request FMLA, but a lot of the prior eligibility hurdles are not present as with regular FMLA. Next slide. So what do folks get if you have one of these COVID qualifying reasons to request this leave? For paid sick leave, you get 80 hours. For full-time employees, get 80 hours of leave. Part-time employees get a number equal to the number of hours worked on average in a 2-week period. And for emergency FMLA, you get a maximum of 12 weeks of FMLA in one 12-month period. Now, how does this dovetail with regular FMLA? Well, if somebody has already taken 6 weeks of FMLA for a broken leg and they're now requesting this child care, I got to stay home with my kid, emergency FMLA, they'll have already blown 6 of their 12 weeks. So it's a combined full 12 weeks of regular FMLA and EFMLA, and that's all you get. So again, it just creates another reason why you can request FMLA. It doesn't require you to pay any more than the 12 weeks that were previously available under the regular Family and Medical Leave Act. So the question that many employers have asked, well, how am I going to deal with the concept of intermittent leave? And the Department of Labor, prior to yesterday, had provided very, very good guidance on this. It said intermittent leave under either the paid sick leave provision or the emergency FMLA provision can be granted if the employer wants to grant it. Otherwise, you can just make somebody take it in full week increments. But this is one of the subjects that were in yesterday's federal court decision that said the Department of Labor's regulation in this space, saying that employer consent is required for intermittent use, was invalid. So it remains an open issue whether or not that part of the regulations, the intermittent leave employer consent rule, has nationwide application. Is it just applied in the Southern District of New York? And so we would recommend, if you're considering not allowing your employees to use either paid sick leave under the FFCRA or emergency FMLA under the FFCRA on an intermittent basis, that you consult with your counsel on that and make an informed decision. A very conservative approach would be just to allow folks to take intermittent leave. A more aggressive approach would be to say it doesn't apply if I'm not in New York. One of the issues with the more conservative approach might be that, however, that you're essentially paying people for a form of FMLA or EFMLA or sick leave that's not otherwise subject to the tax credit. So you might be giving them this benefit, paying people to be out for this leave, and then it might later be determined by the Department of Labor that it's not subject to the tax credit because the Department of Labor might not necessarily agree with one federal court decision that's been issued in New York. So again, to the extent intermittent leave is an issue, and it's going to be, because a lot of folks are saying, look, I don't need this leave on a weekly basis. My kids go into hybrid school. They go to school Tuesdays and Thursdays. They're doing online learning Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I need this on an intermittent basis. I only need to be home 2 days a week. This issue is going to be right square in front of a lot of employers' faces in the next 2 weeks when kids start resuming school. And so we would encourage you to certainly consult with your legal counsel regarding this intermittent use of this leave, as it's really going to be a critical issue going forward. Next slide. How much pay do folks get? This is very regimented, and it's set out in the law. Folks, for reasons 1, 2, or 3 under the paid sick leave provisions, the employee gets their regular rate of pay. However, it's capped at $511 per day, and in the aggregate $5,110. And for reasons 4, 5, and 6, the care for someone else or your kid having to stay at home because of school being closed, it's the regular rate of pay, but it's capped at $200. It's capped at $200 a day. And those same provisions under the EFMLA, again, capped at $200 a day. What about folks who have PTO, vacation, sick? Can they use those? Well, the Department of Labor and the law says you may not, for paid sick leave, require people to use their PTO if they're otherwise available for the FFCRA paid sick leave. You can make them use it for EFMLA. So depending on what leave's been requested, the COVID-19 related reason why they're requesting leave under this new law, you can either make them require them they use their PTO or not. We generally recommend to just let folks use their PTO. You want to have them burn it anyway. It's a benefit that's available in there for them. So if folks want to use it, go ahead and let them use it. But on paid sick leave, you cannot make them use it. Next slide. So just some compliance tips for employers. If you've not already done this, I mean, we've had this law in place since April, and a lot of employers have not really thought about it because they've either been, had everybody working from home anyway, been managing their workforce remotely generally, and it's not really come up, and only until recently with these school closing or school hybrid learning issues coming up has it been at the forefront. But you certainly should educate your managers, your frontline supervisors regarding these new leave rights. So if employees are requesting and socializing these issues with their managers or supervisors, they're aware to involve HR professionals at your company or the legal department to make sure that their rights are being protected. If you haven't already, you should have, if you're covered by this law, that is 500 employees or less, you should have already posted the mandatory Department of Labor FFCRA poster. It needs to be hung where you hang all that other list of the many posters that you're required, the EEO, workers' comp, etc. This needs to be hung with all of those in the workplace in a conspicuous area. You can also post it on an internal website or email to employees. And if you need a copy of that poster, it can be downloaded from the Department of Labor's website in color, easy to be printed and posted. Just Google Department of Labor FFCRA poster and it's going to pop up and you'll have it. We recommend implementing a policy so that employees fully understand the parameters of what leave is available and what rights they have and what rights they don't have. Next slide. We also recommend implementing some forms, creating some forms for employees to request this leave so that they can document what specific reason they have for requesting the leave, how much leave they're requesting, etc. And then it's going to serve as your documentation for when you want to file for the tax credits. The Department of Labor does recommend that the employer keep records regarding this, so that if you're ever audited or it's questioned when you request your tax credit for making these payments for this form of leave, that you're going to have the documentation necessary to satisfy any future audit. And then we also recommend having forms and other follow-up communications with employees when they apply for this leave, some sort of a form or a formal reply process to say your leave has been approved, your leave has not been approved, you don't have one of the qualifying reasons, etc. And making sure that they understand exactly what's been approved and what rights they have. I know that was a lot to cover, but I do want to spend the last 4 or 5 minutes here of the time we've allotted for this program talking about the next issue, and I'm just going to talk very high level about these accommodation issues under the Americans with Disabilities Act, because we're going to start to see a lot of employees as employers are reopening, having folks come back into the workplace. We're going to see folks coming back in and saying, look, I've got issues, I need to be accommodated. So if we could flip to the next slide, please. So obviously the Americans with Disabilities Act has been around a long time. I think probably most folks on this call know what it provides. And the one I want to focus on for the remainder of this program is the requirement under the Americans with Disabilities Act to accommodate qualified individuals with disabilities who request accommodation. If you could page forward to a couple slides, I want to just skip a couple. Go ahead and skip, 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 skip. One more. All right, so I think most folks are, go back one please. Most folks are aware that since 1991 we've had the Americans with Disabilities Act, and it requires that employers accommodate folks when they have a disability, and it prevents them performing one of the essential functions of their job. And so you might be asking, well, what does this mean for purposes of COVID-19? What if I got an employee that says, I've got a condition and it puts me at particular risk with respect to this pandemic, and if I come into the work and I'm exposed and I get this is a bigger issue for me because I'm in what's considered one of the high risk groups. No real changes here. We're business as usual under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The employee has an obligation to let us know of an issue that requires a reasonable accommodation. And then as the EEOC has guided for the last 20 some odd years, the employer has an obligation to engage in a good faith interactive process with the employee, saying, what can we do in the way of accommodations that's going to allow you to perform the essential functions of your job with reasonable accommodation, provided that your requested accommodation is not going to require an undue hardship on the employer. Next slide. So you might say, well, what are these heightened conditions? The CDC has on their website a very comprehensive listing. I'm not going to go through them all here, but lung conditions such as lung cancer, COPD, asthma, heart conditions, heart palpitations, congestive heart failure, diabetes is one of them. There's a whole list there and you can check it, but you can rest assured your employees know what they are if they have one of these conditions. And if they come to you and say, hey, I've got one of these conditions and I want to work remotely, I don't want to come in, is that a reasonable accommodation that you have to have a dialogue with them about? The answer is yes. You can certainly verify that the employee has the condition, and you can certainly verify that the accommodation request that they have requested is actually needed, that working from home is required. And you can certainly talk about other things that might do in the way of accommodation outside of just working remotely. Can they be, sequestered in the workplace where they're not around others? Can they work in a bubble type of environment? All that, though, is subject to the regular ADA requirements that we speak with employees and have that dialogue with them. Even if ultimately you have to reject that accommodation request, it is still an obligation on the employer to have the conversation and see whether you can work it out. It is a ADA violation in and of itself not to have the conversation with employees and try to engage in that interactive dialogue. Next slide. A lot of times it's been an issue for employees if we say, well, we want to establish that you actually have this condition. And normally the ADA would say we could require the production of medical information to establish that they have the disability they're requesting an accommodation for. But right now it's difficult for a lot of folks to actually even get in to see a doctor. Doctors are overwhelmed. They're not seeing people. They're doing telemedicine. So the EEOC has encouraged employers to be thoughtful and flexible about this and its requirements to document a disability. And it suggested other ways that an employer might want to consider this, including prescription records, health plan, insurance records, that type of thing, to show that the employee actually has the condition. Next slide. A really interesting question is, well, what about, and we're seeing this more and more, where somebody says, I don't have a condition, but my wife or my spouse or my kid has a condition. And if I come to work every day and I get it, I'm going to be taking, I get the risk of bringing this home and exposing my high-risk family member. And so does the employer have to accommodate that? The ADA is very clear, and the EEOC has made it very clear that's not required. Only the employee has a right to reasonable accommodation for their own disability. In the situation here where they're asking for accommodation and to not be required to come into the workplace because of a family member, that is not covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act. You know, from a practical standpoint and good, employee relations and human relations, employee morale issues, might you want to still consider such requests? The answer is yes. But are you obligated to under the law? The ADA is very clear on that. You are not. Next slide. I just want to make everyone aware on this call of a potential trap that's very concerning and that the EEOC has already opined on in some formal guidance. Let's say that you've had somebody who, 9-10 months ago asked to work remotely as a reasonable accommodation, and engaging with that employee, you ultimately concluded that, no, this is a job that you have to be in the office, you actually have to come into work and do, and so we can't grant that accommodation. Coming in is an essential function. But since March, you've closed up your office, and March through June, July, whatever we're at now, August, all folks in your workplace have been working remotely. And so now the employee comes to you and says, well, and you're getting ready to go back to work. Everybody's coming back to work now. You're opening your office and you're saying everybody needs to come back now. And this employee says, well, I previously asked you to work remotely and you told me no, but for the last 6 months I've been working remotely and it's not been an issue. So I'm renewing my request. The EEOC has made it very clear that, if the employee and the employer have worked in a remote environment, you're going to have to reconsider that previously denied request, because you've now essentially shown that it's not an undue hardship. You've been able to show as an employer that for this particular employee, working remotely was possible. The employee remained productive. It wasn't an undue hardship on the employer. And where previously you might have concluded it was an undue hardship, your own good intentions of allowing somebody to work remotely for the last 4 or 5 months is going to come back to bite you. So be aware of that, and to the extent previously denied requests to work remote or from home were denied, you're going to need to take a fresh look at that. Next couple slides, please. Skip the next one. Absolutely, you should not be paternalistic in thinking about your employees' health issues. Let them make this call. You can't say, I know Jim or Bob has a heart condition, I'm going to tell them he can't come in. This is the employee's call. If they want to come in, the employer cannot tell somebody they can't come in because they're in a high-risk group. Next slide. Same thing for older employees. Next slide. And same thing for pregnant employees. So ultimately, this is the employee's call. Next slide, please. So even though pregnant employees, folks over 65, people with pre-existing conditions, it might just be better for them to stay home. If the employee doesn't request it and doesn't make that request, the employer should not be making that decision for them and saying, don't come in. And I know what some of you are thinking. You're saying, well, that certainly exposes me to potential issues. Then if they contracted in the workplace, do I have enhanced workers' comp liability there? Is somebody going to say that, I've got now a workplace death because I got this and this person was in a high-risk group? That's just a cost of doing business. The EEOC has made it very, very clear that an employer can't preclude people from coming into the workplace just because they're in one of these 3 high-risk groups. Last slide. Just want to highlight some resources. The EEOC has actually put out some very, very, You know, as a management side employment lawyer, I don't frequently compliment the EEOC, but they've put out some really good and comprehensive guidance in this space, and I would encourage all of you to look at it if you have these issues. It can be found on their website at eeoc.gov/coronavirus. Our law firm, Bryan Cave Leighton Paisner, has really collected a wealth of information on responding to these issues, both under the FFCRA and the ADA under our coronavirus pages at our website. I would encourage all of you to sign up. You just go to our website for our blog at bclpatwork.com. There's a button you click that says sign me up. And as we blog on these topics, like yesterday's new case coming out under the FFCRA, updates from the EEOC, other leave issues that are popping around the various states, you'll have those delivered to you timely to your email inbox as we update the blog. Then, of course, anyone wants to reach out, you can certainly reach me. My email is here on this slide, as is my phone number. I've been told that there's quite a few folks who signed up for this webinar out in California, where First Bank has substantial operations. Bryan Cave Leighton Paisner has 3 offices out in the California area, in Irvine, Santa Monica, and San Francisco. We're well positioned to help anybody out in that area as well. So thanks for your time today, and I'm sorry I took us over a little bit.
Oh, no worries, Charles. Thanks so much for that. So we are just a few minutes over. We did get a ton of great questions in. We got some answers back to people directly where we could. Outside of that, we've logged all of the questions that we have. We are either going to compile those into an FAQ that we're going to put on firstbanks.com/COVID after we end, or we'll still respond to you individually with answers as needed as well. So at this time, I wanted to just give you a reminder to keep a lookout for emails from First Bank. And as always, be sure to check our COVID website that I mentioned. We're going to put the recording of this session on there along with other great information. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. A special thank you to Tim, Eric, and Charles for their time and expertise. Please do take just a few moments to complete a brief survey that's going to pop up right after you leave this session. It'll help us improve our service to you. With that said, have a great day, everyone. We'll catch you next time.